Hi, I'm Matt Lynch. Today I'm going to talk a little bit about Lawmaker, which is a service that I'm responsible for relating to drafting and managing legislation in the cloud. I've got quite a few things I'd like to talk about. I'm trying to cover them quite briefly because there's quite a lot to get through. I want to talk a little bit about what the Lawmaker service is, how it works and what it looks like, and then some reflections on my time working in this field, because it's a really interesting area, working with technology and legislation and parliamentary organisations. It leads to some really interesting results, some real challenges, but it's a really interesting area to work in. So just to give kind of a sense of what the Lawmaker service is about. In one sense, it's just software. It's a service that you can access in the browser if you work for the UK government or the UK Parliament. But it's more than that. And that's what I'm going to kind of take you through some of the details of what it does. So fundamentally, the Lawmaker service is about enabling users of that service to draft and manage legislation in the UK. So it's about being able to draft primary legislation, so bills, the parliamentary amendments to those bills, and to produce the acts at the end of the parliamentary process. But it's also about producing secondary legislation, so all the orders, regulations, rules that the executive agencies in the UK produce. And that's thousands of these things every year. It's a service that's provided by my organisation, the National Archives, to users across a number of organisations, because the way that it works in the UK, the legislative process spans a lot of different parts of government, from the drafting being done within executive agencies, but then the legislative process obviously then continuing through the Parliament. It's managed by my team, and it's we call it a service. We don't call it an app or an application, because it's more than just the software. It's this combination of software. It's the infrastructure that we run this software on. It's the support that we provide to the users of this service. It's the security that we assure to this service all the time. It's the people. That these services don't run without great people in my team and in our suppliers that help us and beyond. And it's all the sub-services that actually you need to run to keep this main service running. What's interesting about Lawmaker, and it's something I'll touch on, is that it covers not just one jurisdiction, but effectively 3 different jurisdictions. And because the way the UK is set up, it has to span both the legislative and the executive branches. So it covers the UK as a whole, so that's the Westminster Parliament and the legislation that goes through that. It covers the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government, and most recently it now covers the Northern Ireland Assembly and the Northern Ireland Executive. So that results in us having a user base of now well over 1,500, and eventually, when everyone who should be using this system uses it, up to 2,500. The users of this system, this service, is essentially for the professional user within government or parliament. So it's legislative drafters, it's parliamentary clerks, it's the publishing teams within parliament, and those related professions. It's not, at the moment, a service that's used by the members, the lawmakers themselves, but it integrates with systems that they use, and maybe one day it will actually be a service that they use directly. Just very briefly, to give a little bit of wider context, within the National Archives, to manage the whole legislative kind of publishing workflow life cycle, we actually run multiple services, and Lawmaker is just one of those services. Lawmaker is the service devoted to the drafting and management of that legislation until it is enacted. So when it's in Parliament, before it even gets on the floor of Parliament, or when it's being drafted by government lawyers if it's secondary legislation. We then run a set of separate services to actually manage the publication of that legislation once it's enacted, and then to update the legislation as it's amended by future legislation. So we run publishing, editorial, and website services on top of that. But because we've integrated them all together, we can deliver great benefits even to the drafting tool by relying on the data that we have through our website service. So that's something again I can mention a little bit more about. I'm not going to dwell on it very much just now, but it's just worth saying that how we got here has been quite an interesting story. What is just worth highlighting perhaps is this has been a real collaboration right from the start. We set out to build a service that could be used by multiple organizations in multiple jurisdictions. So we did that in collaboration with all the organizations that would be affected. So initially that was within the UK and within the Scottish side of things. But that's been a really interesting journey, just first of all, assembling that coalition of organizations to begin with, and then trying to collaborate with them to produce a single service at the end of the day. As you can imagine, they've got lots of interesting and different competing interests, but it's been an interesting journey trying to find a common path that meets all of their needs. And the way we did that was very much in a non-classic approach. We didn't use a waterfall development process. We didn't dwell on large requirement documents. We really got in there, started creating wireframes, worked on prototypes, did experiments, really worked very closely with users to develop something that would meet the needs of those users in future. Just very briefly highlighting, here's some very early wireframes of what we thought our system might look like. These are now 10 years old, I think, where we worked through different ways that the system could work. Even well before the system was actually built, they could do this, but we focused on what it meant to our users, what it would look like. How we run today, we still run this service. Day to day, my team is responsible for this service being maintained and delivered, and importantly, improved continuously. One of the reasons we talk about this being a service rather than just an app or something is that it's not a one-off job. It's not a project. You don't just get to build services like this for parliaments and walk away. You need to build a service and then you need to maintain it. You need to keep it improving. You need to respond to the needs of your users. So that's why we have this continuous team working on it all the time. And then we use a steering group representing all the different partners that are involved to keep the governance and direction heading in the best direction. And just to highlight that it's an ongoing iterative process. I think right from the start, we've tried to build this as an agile service, and that still matters today. We're still continuously finding out new things. We're still continuously getting feedback, trying to build new improvements, new features, and also just in the way of technology, we're then starting to deal with legacy. How do we manage legacy software? How do we keep upgrading and patching things? So it's an ongoing process. Now, what does it look like in practice? How does it work? We built this software according to a number of principles, and these were worked out partly in that experimentation and wireframe process and trying different things. Some of them were just assumptions that we brought to the table at the outset. These were things like we wanted this system to be in the browser. This was a big shift from our history of all the tools that either in parliaments or government they were using were all desktop-based apps, but we wanted to build something in the browser. We wanted something that we could deploy across different parliamentary organizations, different government organizations, and not have to worry about hardware on people's desks. Equally, we wanted to build something that was actually really tailored for these parliamentary users and government users. We didn't want them to be worrying about files and databases and file types. and things like that. We wanted them just to worry about bills and amendments and clauses and the things that they cared about. On the other hand, we had a really strong commitment to legislation as data. We really believe that working with legislation as structured data is the way forward. So we wanted a system that was based from the outset on structured XML, but we wanted to adopt open standards. We chose not to use our own bespoke schema that we already had for legislation. Instead, we adopted the ACOMA and TOZO, or legal doc ML standard, so that we could build a system right from the start that was based around open standards. We wanted to build one system. We didn't want to build lots of systems for all our different user groups. We really wanted to build the notion that this was a shared system. It was a system that promoted collaboration between the different organs of government. And equally, as a flip side of that, we wanted to build a system in the cloud. We didn't want to be responsible for managing servers anymore. We wanted to put it all in the cloud, have something that was scalable, have something, again, that was easy to share across boundaries. So those things guided what we built. And so we ended up with a system that was all about editing bills in the browser. Here's the editor, you can see, that enabled things like multi-user collaboration, that more than one person could work on the same document at the same time, that had permissions-based document management, so that, again, documents could be shared freely, but you could also carefully manage documents when you needed to, when they needed not to be shared. That had things like validation built into the editor, so that we could help guide the user towards producing the right draft legislation if they were drafting things or editing them. At the same time, we still needed to support really high quality print PDFs, because as much as we were trying to shift parliaments into the digital age, there was still that requirement to produce high quality print artifacts. And because of the parliamentary process, we really needed to get the things like line numbering working correctly. We had to manage the complex parliamentary amendment processes, but we also had to try and pull them into the 21st century by giving them functionality, like you can see here, of being able to draft amendments more like track changes on the left, but to then produce traditional page line style amendments automatically, and equally to do the flip side of that, of taking those traditional amendments and automatically applying them to the bill after there'd been a debate in Parliament, so that you could produce the next version of the bill without manual effort. And we really wanted to lean heavily on this law as data thing, and on the fact that as an organisation, the National Archives was already responsible for publishing all enacted legislation through our website, legislation.gov.uk. So one of the more recent themes in all the work we've been doing in Lawmaker is really drawing on that fact that we have access to all enacted legislation in the UK in a high quality structured data format. So we are able, for example, to bring that legislation back into Lawmaker and use it as the basis for new drafts. That's one of the easiest applications, but then we can also do other actions where we process that data and provide a much richer automation or intelligent features for drafters in the editor, for example, looking up the legislative history of provisions being amended and other actions like that. Also, in the nature of us building a system that is very much bespoke and focused on user needs, we were able to invest a lot in cross-referencing and being able to pick up cross-references, and again, relying on the data that we have in our legislation website to link references in any drafts across to the enacted legislation, making it easier to, for example, jump between them or reuse some of that data. That's just a few little highlights of some of the things that we've been working on in terms of delivering this service for legislative drafters and parliamentary clerks. As I say, it really is an ongoing process where we worked initially to build what you might call a platform, a legislation drafting and management platform. And there was a lot of hard work in doing that. You had to produce a system that did the basics, that allowed you to draft these documents, that allowed you to produce nice PDFs, and allowed you to push this legislation through a pipeline into publication on the web and elsewhere. But having done that, we've then been able to go back to what can we actually do to really improve the quality or productivity of our of the outputs and the users. So what can we automate? How can we rely on this data set, particularly the data that we've got, and produce new features? So just to mention a couple of reflections on this process so far. One, just there really is a tension almost between the need to have legislation as paper and legislation as data. We took a strong opinionated position at the outset of this, that we believed that looking at law as data first would actually reap real benefits. And I think some of the functionality we've been able to build in the Lawmaker service is testament to that. But equally, it's been a real shift for our users, and getting them used to, for example, working in an XML editor rather than a word processor, getting them used to some of the restraints and restrictions that structured data might place on their drafting can be tough. And we haven't been able to avoid the considerable effort of still producing beautiful paper products. But I think our users are starting to see, for example, in our ability to resolve these cross-references and our ability to automatically apply amendments. And now also we are starting to apply AI into some of these functions. And again, really relying heavily on the structured data that we have rather than it just being plain text, to really deliver benefits for the users. I hope we're winning the argument that it was worth this shift to law as data. As an aside to that, one of the reflections that I keep coming back to is that XML editors are not word processors. We have spent a lot of time making our legislation editing tools look like word processors, but they're actually an XML editor. And there's an interesting tension here between to get users on board, you often want to appeal to what they're used to, and most of them are used to Microsoft Word. So we built a tool that in some ways apes the way that word processors work, but at the same time the underlying model is so fundamentally different that I still wonder sometimes if we missed a trick there, or we still have to think a little bit harder about how do we bring people across from using word processors to using more structured authoring environments. Another reflection that flows on from this is similar doesn't mean the same. When we set out to build this service many years ago, one of the groundbreaking elements of it was that we wanted to build one service for multiple jurisdictions. And that was based on the conviction that fundamentally the systems, at least within the UK, had a lot of commonality. We all had legislative processes that were similar. But it turns out, of course, that the devil is in the detail. And there was either practical differences between each jurisdiction we worked on, but perhaps more interestingly, there were significant cultural differences. Even, for example, a way that the House of Commons approached its own procedure to, say, the Scottish Parliament approached its procedures. And those cultural differences can have a real impact on user needs and how software has to work. So it's been an interesting challenge to still maintain that common core, but then try and meet the differing needs of different user groups. And on a similar vein, partnerships are tricky, but ultimately really rewarding. Because again, the perhaps innovative part of this project was we did it in collaboration and partnership with both legislative branch and executive branches of multiple governments. And that was great because we could bring more knowledge and resource into this project. We could share the cost of this project. But of course, then managing the competing interests has been a challenge. Delivering for different user groups at different times, because that was the only practical way that we could do it, was a real challenge. But I think overall, it has been a really rewarding process, and hopefully is actually bringing, in some ways, at a practical, non-political level, bringing these organizations slightly closer together and giving them means of appreciating that they are carrying out similar functions for different groups and for different electorates, but they are benefiting from shared tools, and they are even collaborating with each other now in working out what improvements they want, where they want these tools to go, what we can do for them in future. So overall, I think it's a really positive direction. So that really, just in a very brief canter through, is a bit of a outline of what Lawmaker is about, and where we are perhaps going in future. So thank you very much for listening to this presentation.
Thanks, Matt. I have a few questions for you. First one, you said similar doesn't mean the same, and you're supporting 3 different jurisdictions currently. Do you do that with 3 different instances, or have you tried to build one system that serves all at the same time?
That is a good question. We have, I can say yes to both. That we have built one system, so there's still one code base that has all the functionality for all organizations. But for resilience, we now actually run multiple instances of that code base, and we can separate users across those instances. So we effectively at the moment have one now for the UK, one for Northern Ireland and Scotland, and one for secondary legislation. But it's an arbitrary split in a sense, because the functionality on each is the same.
That actually gets to my second question. You mentioned that the system is cloud-based, and a lot of our customers ask about cloud-based, but always have a concern and reservation when it comes to cybersecurity issues and continuation of business issues. Can you talk a little bit about how you address those?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you're right. That's always a concern of anything cloud-based, or even just in any way remote. So we address it in multiple ways. We actually, in relation to each, now having multiple instances is partly targeting that resilience thing, that we could potentially shift people across to different instances if one was compromised. But actually within each of those instances, we effectively run a warm kind of pilot-like backup of the entire system, so that we can actually, if the primary instance fails, we can, within less than a minute, we can switch over to our backup system, which is, I think, replicated every minute or so from the primary system, so very little data loss or anything. Obviously, in practice, we find that the big cloud providers do provide a very high level of availability and resilience, probably better than anything we could do if we did it locally. We invest a lot now in security generally and monitoring. We use tools like Wiz and things like that to try and really keep a very close eye on our overall estate, and kind of constantly patch security stuff. We're investing in things like immutable backups and other approaches to make sure that we've got essentially multiple forms of redundancy. What we still have not done is moved into a full offline capacity.
Mm-hmm.
Partly still with the thought that every other bit of their systems are effectively these days in some way cloud-based or at least network-based. And we're not sure there's much use to having an online version of or an offline version of Lawmaker if you can't actually email the thing that you've made, or you can't access your printer, which is in a different building anyway, to print it out. So we have to date generally encouraged the kind of ultimate backup plans to be more basic. That at the end of the day, if everything really does go wrong, you might be better with a photocopier and a pen and paper, rather than some very expensive technical solution.
You mentioned that you support right now Westminster, Scottish Parliament, and Northern Ireland. Any plans to take it elsewhere, like Wales or maybe other levels of government?
We are talking to Wales at the moment, and that would be definitely my ambition, is to have Lawmaker extend to Wales. That would then complete the set as far as the UK is concerned. We are really keen to see where the technology that we built could be used elsewhere. So we are always talking to others about the potential for that. I would like to see at least the patterns or some of the elements of what we've done be reused elsewhere. I think it is back to that similar but not the same. There comes a point where
it's too different,
but there's still bits perhaps of what we've done that could be reused.
Which brings me to my next question. 30 years you mentioned you use a Como and Tozo, which of course had to be adapted to the UK style of government. Can you talk a little bit about how that worked out for you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it was quite a controversial decision when we made that decision initially. We did have the Crown legislative markup language, which we had developed and is still used as our core schema for publishing legislation. But we had done work prior to Lawmaker even starting of developing a transform from our existing schema to a Como and Tozo. That was work that Jim Mangiafico had done for us a long time ago. So we knew that we could transform our existing data set to that open standard. And I think we were just really keen to not assume that our own schema was the best schema to build an editing environment on. We'd built that schema for publishing, not as an authoring schema. And we felt that a Como and Tozo worked generally as the design of a Como and Tozo seemed to us to be a good fit for an authoring environment. And we also hoped that by aligning ourselves with open standards, we were going to find a slightly bigger market in terms of supplier pool of people who might have an interest in this or who might build tools for us. It's still, I mean, the pool of suppliers who have any knowledge in this domain is vanishingly small across the world. So I think we hoped by at least aligning with a standard, we might increase that pool slightly. But I think it has worked out for us well. I still feel that it's positioning us in the right place that we want to be. The data that we are producing, we are finding, even for for example, for like AI applications and stuff, actually working with our with XML and open standard is actually a better place to start from than something bespoke. We have, since Lawmaker started, we've created other services, including, most importantly, Find Case Law, which is now our case law publishing service. And we have, again, from the get-go there, decided to publish the case law in a Como and Tozo. And again, that's partly this, trying to get the convergence across our services and try and get that data to be align. So I think it's worked out well for us.
As I know that you have an interesting take on the other aspect of this problem's workflow. The approach you've taken isn't the classic workflow approach. Can you talk just a little bit about that?
Sure. I mean, as I said at the outset, we tried very much as a project to focus on our users. And what did our users want? We were coming from a situation where our users were using desktop applications, mostly Word or Adobe FrameMaker. They were essentially working on, either editors, authoring tools or word processors. They didn't see their process as, at least at the time, as something that was kind of workflow based, or that they wanted workflow tools. They saw this as a document management and document authoring, fundamentally about these, the documents were the first order objects that they cared about, the bills, the draft bills. They had internal processes about how things worked, and generally a very high level of kind of professional pride and standards in the work that they did. That I think our users felt that they were able to manage process and standards and things through their business process or their approach to things, that they didn't want the software to constrain them into very fixed workflows. And so that's the approach that we tried to adopt. We tried to build a system that really treated the document as being front and center of everything, and gave them the flexibility to work with it in the way they did, whether they wanted to work on one large document with multiple people, or whether they wanted to split it into lots of little documents and then build it together. We wanted to give them that freedom and only really manage the touch points and workflow at a minimum, and let them do everything else essentially off canvas, with the thought, because again, this is a continuous service, that if they eventually identified real bits of workflow that they wanted, that they really wanted, not that they just thought they might want, but they'd actually worked out that it was really valuable, we could always add that at a later date. If you had the core, if you get the core right, then putting workflow on top is a lot easier.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a question about one of your points about laws data. And I know the change management on this sounds like it was probably pretty interesting to go through with everybody. But what was your basic argument, and what do you think were the winning arguments in terms of why laws data is actually important for a parliament at all?
Sure. We often started, when we were kind of running this argument, was, let's look at the end of the process. There's even as I've a former life as a legislative drafter, and we've always said that one of the difficulties in drafting legislation is that the immediate audience for legislation is your parliament, is your legislature, but the actual functional audience for legislation is the public, way down the line when it becomes law. And there's a tendency to forget that, or you focus on your immediate audience, you focus on something that the lawmakers are going to pass, and forgetting that actually this is going to impact on people's lives. And it's a bit the same with legislation, as we've tried to turn the argument and go, well, actually look at how legislation is used. Legislation is used, it's accessed 95% on the web. It's accessed by members of public and by non-legal professionals mostly. And they need that legislation in a more accessible format. They need to be able to see it in different formats. They need tools that are going to help them understand that legislation and process that legislation, perhaps to do things, or even into the kind of rules as code type movement, to produce software that might do their tax returns based on that law. So if you focus on the needs of that user group, then that says, well, actually, we need the legislation to come out in a good format that we can do that with. And if you just keep drafting your legislation in Word or something like that, then it's hard for us to turn it into this, to do those future things and make it more accessible to people. So, that was kind of that was our kind of first argument. And then the second argument was really just about, we can do so much more, even at that first stage of providing tools to the clerks or the drafters, if you will accept that it's going to be fundamentally structured data. We can make it more productive, because we can make that pipeline run really fast. If you keep it structured, then you're producing those beautiful PDFs, and those web pages is trivial. But we can also do really clever things by crunching that data. Like we have things, for example, that add automatic footnotes, which analyze the legislative history of references that you make and give you the whole history of that that provision. And in the past, drafters had to do that manually, looking up the books or looking up the websites themselves. But we've got all that data, so we just process it and stick it in. So we can deliver some real tools that help them.
Do you think that the arguments on what arguments tended to win the day? Is it the internal efficiency of maybe some automation on producing secondary instruments, or is it was it the digestion by the public and the corporates or whoever are trying to utilize that data? What helps an internal group make that switch? How do they argue with their bosses that they need to do this?
A good question. It probably always comes down to the money, doesn't it? I think it was a combination, and maybe again in our case, because it was a collaboration, what you actually had was different partners running different arguments, perhaps. And in some cases there was, sometimes you just ran the simpler argument of our current tools are legacy tools. We can't support them anyway, so we need to move somewhere, and this is the direction that the train is going. So, let's hop on this wagon.
Can you say anything about the AI tools that you've been working with? You mentioned that you're using some AI now.
Yes, we've been exploring slowly and carefully where we can introduce generative AI into Lawmaker. And one of our first tools that we're just going to release in beta shortly is the automation of generating of keeling schedules. So that's like prospectively amended versions of legislation, where again, it's another example where we're relying on the fact that we have all the data of enacted legislation through our publishing website, and we can draw that into Lawmaker, and then we're using language models to analyze the draft that user is working on, extract all the amendments from that draft, and then apply them to the enacted legislation to produce a new output that we can further modify in Lawmaker. But it's worth saying that what we are approached this is actually in quite maybe a hybrid approach of we are using AI, but we're still using quite a lot of algorithmic, traditional algorithmic processing, and trying to harness the natural language abilities of language models, natural language processing, rather really than the true generative abilities.
That makes sense.
Have you found any applications for that natural language processing? Personally, I think one of the biggest benefits of what we've seen with AI recently is the way that we interface with it. We can talk to it like a human. Is there any interest in that type of interface in this area?
Yeah, that's something we are starting to tentatively explore, very much at the early days. But yes, there has been quite a lot of interest. In the UK government, like in the wider UK government, they released a tool recently called Redbox, which was essentially a chatbot to enable you to interrogate ministerial paperwork. The idea being the red box that the ministers get sent home with at the weekend with their papers to digest. This is a chatbot that you can use to interrogate all that data. And I'm certainly interested in the ideas of where that kind of interface might fit within a drafting tool. But we are very much at the stage of just playing around with what it might look like and talking to users to see what they might do with it if they had something like that.